Hello everybody, I'm Mighty Jamie and I'm joined as usual by Mapasega Murwa. And together we are the Afro Mavericks, another episode of the Afro Maverick Show. But I want to say something though, you are Afro Mavericks too. This whole show is about having local, regional and global conversations from an African perspective. Why Mavericks? Because we want to flip it on its head. We want to change the discourse around Africa and around the world, in fact, because the African perspective is one that's often ignored. So thank you for being with us on this journey, being with us this long. We'll really appreciate it. We'll appreciate the comments, the follows on Twitter, all of it we appreciate. Now, let's get to the topic of the day. The 21st of February is a significant day because it is the day when this guy was born way back in 1924. So if he was still alive, he would be 96 right now. So the question is, is the question. Not quite young. I mean,
that is quite young.
Well. I hope we have that kind of youthfulness. The question is, how should we remember Robert Gabriel Mugabe? Now, Maps thinks that we should remember him as a paradox, and I have a different view. But let's start with you, Maps. What's your case? How should we remember Bob?
Okay, I'm gonna keep Bob. Uncle Bob.
Uncle
okay.
Bob.
Uncle Bob, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep it very short and say, number one, we should remember Mugabe as the African socialist, right? He was a paradox. And number one, merely because of that, he was an African socialist who actually believed that he could give his people land and actually benefit them. In fact, when he was asked, how do you want to be remembered? He said this, and I quote, a man who fought in the struggle for liberation of his people, had ideas of the ownership of resources, wanted for his people to unite, guarding against colonialism and imperial powers that seek to undermine the authority of governments, his people to remain revolutionary throughout. So he desired that his own people would be masters of his own destinies. That's what he said he wanted to be remembered as. Whether or not we do is a bit of a challenge, right? So number one, I know there's been a lot of contestation as to whether or not the African socialism were his ideas, because some people are like, no, actually he was a mouthpiece. But we know that he went to Ghana to study, and that's when he actually encountered African socialism, learning from Kwame Nkrumah, right? So we know that actually socialism works. We look at the Soviet Union, they proved it until the US actually crashed them. We see it in Libya, it worked, right? Until Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated. So in terms of socialism, it doesn't work where there is corruption, and then it looks like socialistic policies cripple the economy of that particular country, but it's actually corruption, right? Number two, I would actually say it's because he had an investor-friendly land policy. Where he would expropriate land, right? And he had an agreement with the Margaret Thatcher administration where they would actually compensate those farmers, right? Tony Blair came in and then retracted and said, but actually not all of us here are of UK or British descent. There were some Irish people who then contested that actually we were colonized as Irish people, so why should we then have to pay this price? So he had this investor-friendly policy, but then Tony Blair is somewhat to blame also for what then escalated after he was not able to implement that policy. So he actually had a plan where some farmers would actually be able to teach black farmers, white farmers would teach black farmers how to farm, and they would be able to then create food security in the country. Zimbabwe's GDP in the first decade of Mugabe's rule actually grew by 11%, right? It was actually the same case in Libya. So it shows that those socialistic policies actually worked. However, when the sanctions came, that's when the deterioration of Zimbabwe began, right? So on one hand, he was this great African socialist who spoke for his people, who fought for his people, who wanted to ensure that his people owned resources. But then there was another side, a man who held on to power, who allegedly won power through defrauding the system, right? And there's also the alleged Joshua Nkomo attempted assassinations, right? The other thing would be, which is, whenever I speak to a Zimbabwean person, this is the core of why Mugabe was a bad person. And it's the massacre of the Ndebeles in Zimbabwe. So on one hand, his ideology was amazing, right? Certain policies were amazing. But then on the other hand, he massacred people, right? Or allegedly, because he's denied it. Mnangagwa has also denied it as well. So on the other hand, there is this man who's held on to power, even though he saw that, him being in power was no longer useful or beneficial to his people. So he's absolutely a paradox, and that's how.
So, but where do you place him?
Exactly
in the net balance, do you celebrate him or do you spit when you think about him? Where do you land?
I frown, right? But at the same time, there's a level of respect for how he stood up for African socialism. I mean, to go to the UN and say, but this is our land. You need to protect that land. So
you don't go as far as Julius Malema would. You wouldn't do a memorial service for him. But you'd be like, I see what he was trying to do, and I don't blame him.
I understand him, and I don't blame him entirely. Also because, look, he tried to implement the certain policy, and then it was the people of Zimbabwe who said, okay, well, this policy is not being implemented, and they actually went to start taking the land themselves. So the sanctions came about as a way of the people taking back the land themselves.
Okay, so you make two distinctions here. You don't blame Mugabe for the economic failure. You say it was successful.
Not entirely. Entirely.
So your case is it was successful first 11 years, and then after, in the 90s when Tony Blair reneged on the Lanchester House, that's what caused the problems, plus sanctions.
And him staying in power and not seeing that it's not working any longer, but still wanting to stay in power.
Okay, all right, I understand. So let me give you my view of Robert Mugabe, and I've articulated it also, but let me give it to you here in full, no interruptions or edits or whatever, although we may edit this, but still. Number one, I think that you judge somebody by the whole legacy of their work, the full body of work. I don't make a distinction for this half, that half, that. I think when somebody has completed their work, and normally at death, you can look at the full performance, and the full performance does matter. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's important to recognize where Zimbabwe is now. And we can very forthrightly say Zimbabwe 1 is a failed state, right? It is failed as a democracy, and it's failed economically. Over 90% unemployment rate. There's no currency. The inflation rate right now is well over 1,000%. The queues for fuel, the queues for money, the money system as it exists right now is a cacophony of mishaps and chaos, to say the very least. So that's where Zimbabwe is now. The third thing I would say is I think that when you make these assessments, you actually need to look at it from the perspective of the citizens, best interest of the citizens over the political ideology, in fact. I think that it's always important to look at who the democracy serves, not the people who are providing the service. Their perspective, for me, is secondary to the service recipients. So if somebody says, well, I intended to give you a steak, but you gave me zinger wings, my view as the customer supersedes yours, right? So that's one. Okay, there's a bit of a sound.
Oh, what is that?
I'm not sure. Okay, so let me continue. So having said that, right, I think that now we then need to look at the legacy question. Did Robert Mugabe make things better in Zimbabwe? And also, how did he treat his people? So ultimately, I think that Robert Mugabe did not make things better. One, his choice of government was a one-party state. He coerced people to that particular democratic dispensation in the 80s, and it proved to be a bad dispensation. When you contrast it with South Africa, which chose a multi-party democracy, a true one, I think that what it led to was vibrant institutions, which is what Zimbabwe needed when it started facing its economic and social difficulties. The fact that you effectively had a dictator who could not be challenged and one who used violence against his own people meant that the strategic reforms that needed to be made in the 90s, when the economy started facing real challenges, could not be made because it was basically Mugabe's way or death. And I think that's problematic. That one-party state was problematic. Number two, I think when you look at the brutality, how he governed over the 38 years that Mugabe was in power. So when you look at the brutality of the regime under Robert Mugabe, I think that speaks to the quality of life that citizens faced under him. So it's not just a matter of the one-party state. It's also a matter of the repression under Mugabe. So basically people's lives for that duration of time under him were not pleasant lives because you couldn't voice a different opinion. You couldn't differ from what was the line of march from Robert Mugabe. And I think that's something that's critical to consider is if you're living for 38 years in a space where you disappear, where you're tortured, where you're brutalized. And remember, the Gugurahundi was not just a matter of killing people, it was also a matter of starving them. So if you look at Matabeleland North, what they did there, that's where most of the killings happened. But during that time, there was also a drought in the south. So there was a lack of delivery of drought relief. So people were suffering from hunger and starvation there. People died, growth of infants was stunted, and all of that is significant. So when you look at the man's period of governance, what you note is that people were more miserable under Mugabe than they are in other dispensations. So that's something that's significant. Then you look at the rigging, of elections, which is problematic in and of itself, the suppression of the will of the people when they decide that they no longer want you. But over and above that, one of the criticisms I have of Robert Mugabe that I think is fair to make is that he mismanaged the state of Zimbabwe. Roads were in disrepair. A lot of things were happening. It's one thing to be under economic embargo, similar to what Cuba was going under when they were under sanctions, or Iran even. The difference between Cuba, Iran, and Zimbabwe is that Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF mismanaged the resources they still had control of. There was poor management, there was corruption, there was nepotism. Those kind of things you can't blame an outside state for. It's one thing to see that our furniture is old. It's another thing where your furniture is broken because the people who were in charge of taking care of it failed to do so. So that's my critique of Mugabe. And when I look at him, I would not even go as far as say, oh, it's a paradox, it's complicated. I would actually say this guy needs to be put in the bad side of the ledger, even though there was Pan-African ideology espoused by Mugabe.
Which comes to my question, is there anything positive, even if it's just one thing
but I don't think
from Mugabe?
I don't think that we can say, for instance, if to use a very crass metaphor, right, if we have a pile of shit in the room, right, and we're trying to make an assessment of it, we can make an assessment and say, well, whoever left this pile of shit no longer has shit in their body, right? But it doesn't mean that the shit itself is of value. Do you understand what I'm saying? So to go back to this question of Pan-Africanism, I think that we have Pan-African icons who don't have the compromises you need to make to celebrate Mugabe or even put him in a paradox box. I think you've got Thomas Sankara, you've got Lumumba, you've got Nyerere, and others. You can make a whole list. People where you don't have to make compromises to celebrate them. So I don't know why we must even try to go back to Mugabe and try to salvage something from it when it's very clear that this guy was an oppressive dictator who spoke the right things but didn't execute the right things for his people.
Initially, he tried.
Well, I don't even give him that much credit for that stuff. I think in the 80s, if you look at when Gugurahundi happens, it's early in the 80s. It's in the infancy of his regime. And I think that people ignored it because it wasn't targeting white people. This is the global community. They made some noise about it, but because the white farmers were still all good, they ignored it. But if you were a civilian in the state suffering from Gugurahundi, for you, from the very beginning, it was an oppressive regime. You don't get a honeymoon period. You just get oppression from the jump. And even though people can say, well, other parts of the country were prospering, what does that matter to you when 20,000 people were killed, when you suffered starvation in the time of famine, when you've been suffering from repression and brutality from the jump? So for me, when I look at it, I don't actually I don't discredit Mugabe accomplishments. I don't discredit
You're not-
participation.
you're not
However,
even
what I'm
naming
saying,
one.
what I'm saying is, remember what I started off by saying. You judge the book by its whole performance, and you got to look at it from the perspective of the service recipient, not the service deliverer. If he comes and say, well, I had good intentions, well, this and this happened whilst I was on the way, then I must compare you with other countries. We have the same challenges, Cuba, Iran, and I say, they didn't mess up, right? You still have a certain quality of life in Cuba that you don't have in Zimbabwe. You still have a certain quality of life, even in Iran, they've been under sanctions forever. Right, you still have a certain quality of life. You don't have that quality of life in Zimbabwe. It is a failed state. You can't take an Iranian and offer them Zimbabwe. They won't accept that because they'll be like, this is not going to work.
Major challenges.
They've got major challenges, but they don't have roads peppered with potholes. They don't have a failed currency. They don't have 90% unemployment. Those are the kind of challenges I'm pointing at. Yeah, true. But when the state of Rhodesia transitioned to Zimbabwe, a lot of the infrastructure was inherited. If you're under sanctions, let's say you've got 10 years, you've had 10 years of economic prosperity, 1980 to 1991, right? 11 years by your version, right? In those years, you need to consolidate the gains. You need to expand on those gains. You need to build a state further than the state you inherited. You don't mismanage, right? And at the point where you realize that things have gone left and now you have to consolidate your bases, a prudent leader would be able to take the little that they have to make sure that the house is still clean and well managed. I'll give you another example. Russia is able to do a lot more in their state with a very reduced budget. Russia does not have the kind of budgetary power that China or America has, but they're under sanctions as well. Their economy has actually been under a lot of pressure because of the sanctions imposed after the invasion of Crimea. But Putin has been able to deliver a certain quality of governance that Robert Mugabe was not able to. So I can't give him a get out of jail free card merely on the basis of powerful speeches that he gave.
Honest.
So I put him in the negative ledger of African history, purely negative. I don't put him in the it's complicated box.
Okay. I think we'll agree to disagree. I think at the end of the day, it's unfair to judge Robert Mugabe on just the shortcomings and the negative side of things. I think there are some positive things, and we deserve to actually he deserves to be credited for that. And to completely just, shove it down the toilet and say, but look, the negatives outweighed the positive is completely unfair, especially on a continent like Africa, where he was able to be bold enough, courageous enough to stand against, colonial and imperialistic rule, and to actually go all the way to the UN to defend that at a time when it was unpopular, right? It couldn't even be titled as populism because it was something completely strange, unheard of, as compared to now where it's really popular to come out as a leftist. So he was bold, he was courageous, a hero in a way for some time. And then there was a time where he was completely ruthless and his rule was disgusting. But I think that, his legacy should be exactly that, a paradox. We must consider both sides and we can all learn from it.
All right, we're out of time. Let's leave it there. Please share your views on Mugabe. How should we remember him? Negative ledger, paradox, positive ledger. We're keen to hear from you. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey. We'll maybe revisit this topic later, another time, different context, maybe have some guests in. We're building up to bigger and better things. Look out for that. Till the next time. Peace.
Goodbye.